Washington this afternoon as the backyard brawl is about ready to take place between the Colts and the Redskins. Hi, I'm Merle Herman with Mike Hafner. Mike, you've played with winners and you've played with the losers. The Colts are losers. What's it like?
The Colts, as we know them today, are located in Indianapolis. But prior to 1984, this team got its notoriety in Baltimore. Beginning in 1953, they solidified themselves as one of the NFL's most successful franchises. In 1958, they played and won in what many call the greatest game ever played. It's arguably the most important game of the 20th century, considering what it did to help popularize American football. They won the championship again the following year.
The defending world champions broke the game wide open. The delirious Colt fans tackled the impossible task of dismantling steel goalposts set in concrete.
Then, in 1970, they won Super Bowl V, which was their second appearance in the big game in 3 years. And throughout the 70s, the Baltimore Colts were a regular playoff team. However, in 1977, after making the playoffs for the third year in a row, the Colts' season ended in heartbreaking fashion with a double overtime loss to the Raiders.
There were lots of highlights in the Colt-Raider game. The only bad news, of course, was the final score.
The final highlight was the worst.
That was.
The final one.
As devastating a loss as this was, what was in store for the fans of Baltimore in the coming years was much worse.
Well, you play the game from the neck up, really. Everybody's got talent. The problem is the first bad break that goes against them, they'll quit first.
But before the end of Colts football in Baltimore, back in 1977, no one in that city saw darkness on the horizon, as the Baltimore Colts were one of the best teams in football. Now, before we continue, I'd like to thank Display for sponsoring this video. Posters like this, and this, and this are absolutely dope. I mean, come on. This colorful abstract look, combined with vintage football, is about as good as it gets in my opinion. And I can't wait to get this piece on my wall. Whatever your style is, all these posters on Display are high-quality prints on metal, which are mounted on the wall with help of a magnet. They're super easy to not only hang, but also change designs. I've shown you just a few of the countless sports designs, but there's also millions of other beautiful prints available from gaming, movies, music, and much more. With Display, you can build collections of the things that you are passionate about right on your wall. And it's cool because with every display you buy, you build one tree. Collectors Fest is happening now for a limited time. Take the opportunity with one of the biggest sales of the year to build your display collection with what you're passionate about. Click the link in my description to see some of my favorite displays and to get my special discount. One display is 29% off, 2 to 4 is 35% off, and 5+ is 40% off, which will be automatically applied to your cart. Once again, thank you to Display for the sponsor. Now let's get back to the video. Let's kick things off in 1978.
Optimism was in the air, and in the new season, the love affair between Colt fans and their team was ready to be resumed. Everyone from ball boy to team owner felt the sky was the limit for the 78 Colts.
Throughout the 70s, the Baltimore Colts had made a name for themselves through excellent quarterback play and a capable defense. On the defensive side, they were led by a front four nicknamed the Sack Pack. However, the optimism for the 1978 season quickly diminished after star quarterback Burt Jones separated his shoulder in the preseason. Leaning on the backup, Baltimore started the season in catastrophic fashion. Not only did they fail to score versus the Cowboys, but they dropped another goose egg in Week 2 versus the Dolphins, losing by a combined 80 points. They turned the ball over an astounding 10 total times, and as bad as their offense was, their defense was worse, allowing over 1,000 yards combined in those two games. Week 3 was one of the few bright spots in the season, Despite being overwhelming underdogs, the Colts scored 27 points in the fourth quarter in one of the biggest regular season upsets in NFL history. In this game, running back Joe Washington became the first player to throw and pass for a touchdown, as well as return a kickoff to the house. The rest of the season didn't see much success, however, as the Colts won just 4 more games and finished with the worst point differential in the league by a landslide. Crazy enough, the 1978 Colts defense, which finished dead last in the league, was still much better than the defense they had in 1981. But we will get to that in a little bit. First, I want to talk about the team's owner at the time, Robert Irsay. Let me briefly name the good things about this guy, although there isn't much. The Colts were initially saved from relocation in 1972 by Robert Irsay, who acquired them from their first owner, who had preferred to move them out west, but after Irsay acquired them, he wanted to stay in Baltimore. Throughout his time as the owner, Irsay tried to improve the team's stadium, which they shared with the MLB franchise, the Orioles. Many consider this to be the worst pro sports stadium in the country. For example, just 1 year after winning the Super Bowl in 1970, there was a committee that determined that the stadium had some serious problems. Just to name a few, 10,000 seats had a poor view, 20,000 seats were outdated with no back support, 7,000 were poorly constructed bleachers for football only. There wasn't enough office space for both front offices, both teams had to share a locker room, the upper deck didn't circle the field ending at the 50-yard line, and there wasn't enough bathrooms. But despite Irsay and others' desire to make improvements or replace the stadium entirely, the city said no, and Baltimore passed an amendment banning funding for any future new stadiums. So Irsay tried and did not succeed. And that's about it for his redeeming side as the team's owner. Here's some of the bad. Irsay made many enemies due to his erratic tendencies.
The last time you courted Jackson,
I don't want to talk to you.
He feuded publicly with head coach Ted Marchibroda, despite gutting his roster of many talented players during the late 70s. He accused quarterback Burt Jones of milking his chronic shoulder injury.
I broke 4 ribs in the left side of my rib cage 7 weeks in a row. Every week I broke my ribs. Every week we'd go in at halftime and x-ray them to make sure they weren't poking any lungs.
He threatened to move the Colts to several football-less cities, including Indianapolis, which did happen later on. Linebacker Barry Krause said in a 2001 interview that Irsay would, quote, come in drunker than hell.
I haven't been in Arizona.
And fire people, fire players. In 1979, John Dutton, the 3-time Pro Bowl defensive lineman and the best member of the Sack Pack, had seen enough. He refused to play for the Colts, holding out at the start of the 1979 season. Irsay then traded him to the Cowboys, and Sutton later gave this wild statement, quote, I'm so grateful, I would do anything Dallas wanted me to do, except shoot someone. The once formidable Sack Pack had begun fading while Dutton was still on the Colts, but after Dutton was traded, it collapsed entirely. The 1979 Colts missed the playoffs for a second straight year. After the season, Irsay fired Marchibroda, even though he had a winning record in Baltimore, and despite the fact that star quarterback Burt Jones only appeared in 7 of the previous 32 games. The worst part was Irsay hired previous Eagles coach Mike McCormick to replace Marchibroda. McCormick had a losing record in Philly, which meant that this may have been the first time in NFL history a coach with a winning record was fired and replaced by a coach with a losing record. Things looked bright at first though, when the team got off to a 7-6 start in 1980, but the team lost their final 3 games, mostly due to their defense falling apart. Their offense finished top 10, but their defense had huge issues. With their first pick in 1980, despite desperate needs all over the defensive side, the Colts picked a running back, despite being stacked at the position. This decision left sports writers and fans scratching their heads. Going into the 1981 training camp, only a handful of defensive veterans remained from the team's heyday. And perhaps the most important one, defensive signal caller and middle linebacker Ed Simonini suffered a bad injury during the preseason. As the quarterback of the defense, this was a devastating blow. To make matters worse, the veteran was replaced by Ed Smith, a 12th round backup who was not ready to start, let alone be the captain of the defense. In week 1, the Colts got off to a surprising start, beating the Patriots 29-28. But problems defensively began to arise by week 2. The Colts gave up 4 passing touchdowns in each of their next 2 games. And despite a 500-yard performance by their offense in week 4, they still lost. Coach McCormick called out his backup, now starting linebacker Ed Smith. Quote, "I don't understand it. We see 10 people doing exactly what we want, and one man makes an error." Week 6, after a blowout 41-19 loss versus the Bengals, this is what Cincinnati quarterback Ken Anderson said after the game. Quote, "This was the best offensive game of the year. They just couldn't seem to stop us." The following game was another embarrassing defensive showing for the Colts, as they gave up over 40 points again to Dan Fouts and the Chargers. The defense had been rough 2 weeks in a row, but this next game takes the cake. Despite the Browns turning the ball over 6 times, let me repeat that, 6 times, the Colts still gave up over 40 points for a 3rd straight game. Following the contest, Browns quarterback Brian Sipe was asked by reporters in the locker room, quote, "What plays were working best for you today?" He answered, "I did not have to call plays today. I just told Ozzie, the team's tight end, run out anywhere on the field and you'll be open. This was like playing in the schoolyard today."
Landry, there it is. The kick is blocked. And Landry tried to recover and rolls free. The Colts have it. And it's going to be pulled out of bounds at the lateral of the round. Here's Landry. Landry to the 5. Landry is going in for a touchdown. That's the wildest play in the history of the league.
Despite pulling off one of the luckiest plays I've ever seen, no amount of luck was going to save this team in 1981.
Now they go to the ground. Beautiful move by McNeil. McNeil takes all the way.
2 weeks later, after giving up 40-plus points 3 weeks in a row, it would happen once again. The Colts surrendered 41 to the Jets, marking the 4th time in 5 games that the defense allowed 40 or more points. In their next game, Week 11, the defense actually held the Eagles under 40, just barely. And this was mostly due to the Eagles' backups playing much of the second half. I'll be honest, Eagles quarterback Ron Jaworski said after the game, "I don't remember a game like this where we could do whatever we wanted on offense." Now, I think you get the point about how bad this defense is to this point, but something else happened during this game that's much crazier than simply a bad team playing poorly. Sitting in the coaching box at Veterans Stadium, owner Robert Irsay got fed up with his team's performance in the 3rd quarter. So he picked up the telephone and ordered McCormick to replace quarterback Burt Jones with backup quarterback Greg Landry. Irsay later appeared on the sidelines, ordered Jones back into the game, and called several plays. Needless to say, the coach and players were stunned and demoralized. After receiving criticism, Irsay assured fans that he wouldn't call any more plays, but he would stay on the sidelines to counsel McCormick with his enlightened leadership. Quote, "It's like when you build a building," Irsay said. "You hire a professional architect and engineers and let them go at it. But at the same time, if things aren't going the way you want, you say, 'Hey, I don't want this. Here's more of what I want.'" Linebacker Barry Krause, probably the best defender on the 1981 Colts, described the team's locker room culture in a 2001 Sporting News interview. Quote, "I lost 5 games in 3 years at Alabama, and I walked in there, and we lost 11 to 12 games, and nobody cared." And like I said earlier, Krause said that in that era, owner Robert Irsay would, quote, "come in drunker than hell,
And I don't need any aggravation,
and fire people, fire players." Needless to say, players on this team were not fans of Irsay, and they didn't like Coach McCormick either. This coach had a tendency to call out players unfairly and was described as weak-willed. This is what McCormick said about himself later in life. Quote, "I wanted to be like my mentor, Paul Brown. He was a great teacher, and I tried to do the same. But unfortunately, I always let my emotions carry me away." John Dutton, the player I mentioned earlier who was the leader of the sack pack that was traded away before 1981, described the situation in a Washington Post interview in December of that year. Quote, "I can talk to them and look at their faces and see how much they're hurting inside. They realize they have no future with the Colts. You are not talking about washed up players. They've got talent and character, but they've knocked the spirit out of these guys." In week 14, the Colts faced the perennial juggernaut that was the Dallas Cowboys. And how do you think the Colts defense fared against one of the best rush offenses in the NFL? It went as expected. The defense surrendered 354 rushing yards to Tony Dorsett and company. The Colts had lost their 13th straight game. This was the most rushing yards that any team gave up that year, and no one rushed for more than that for another 6 seasons. And this is what Coach McCormick said after the game, somehow straight-faced. Quote, "All right, this may sound stupid because we were giving up 35 points a game, but we're playing better defense. We're 1-13, but we've still got pride." 1 week later, the Redskins pummeled them. And this was the week that the 1981 Colts shattered the record for the most points allowed by an NFL team in a season. With 1 game remaining, the Baltimore Colts were in line to possess the number 1 pick. And in poetic fashion, they went out and played their best game of the season, beating the Patriots for the 2nd time. Despite losing their other 14 games, most of them badly, the Colts were amazingly 2-0 versus their division rival in 1981. But joke's on them, the Patriots sucked that year too. And with that loss, the Patriots finished with the same record as the Colts. And due to the tiebreaker, New England now possessed the number 1 pick. So the one thing that the Colts had going their way, they fumbled it away. When the 1981 season was all said and done, looking at the Colts statistically would have been the product of endless memes today. They gave up 125 more points than the 2nd worst defense in the NFL. That's unreal. Think about it this way. The Cardinals were atrocious. They gave up 25 points a game that season. And even then, they would have had to play 5 more games with the 2nd worst defense in the league to equal what the Colts had given up. Baltimore gave up a staggering 33.3 points a game, allowing a total of 533 points. This is one of 6 major defensive records that still stand today. They originally set the record for the most yards given up in a season, but that was broken by the 2012 Saints. Coincidentally, these 2 teams are tied together by one man, Joe Vitt. Vitt was the Colts' quality control coach at the time, and in 2012, he served as the Saints' interim head coach. Now, there's a pretty solid argument that this 1981 Colts team had the worst defense in NFL history, but also, they are one of the worst teams ever, period. Sure, the Colts won 2 games, and teams like the 2008 Lions and the 2017 Browns failed to win a single game. But those teams were much more competitive on a weekly basis than the Colts were. To put it simply, if it weren't for their quarterback and former MVP Burt Jones, this team probably would have finished 0-16. The only team in NFL history with a worse point differential in a single season is the 1976 Tampa Bay Bucks. And it's almost unfair to even compare anybody to that 76 Bucs squad. That was the first year of their expansion franchise, and they played that season with essentially practice squad players and the aging veterans that other teams didn't want. The 1981 Colts had the following: a bad owner, an incapable coach, and even rumors of racial discord between players in the locker room. Any of these things individually can completely derail a team's will to succeed, and the Colts had all 3.
Well, I think the biggest obstacle that we're going to be confronted with is being patient and developing a very sound football team. I think this is the most important factor from the standpoint of not expecting too much too soon. And I think if we go into it with that attitude, there's no question in my mind that this will be a successful program.
After 2 failed seasons, the Colts fired Mike McCormick and brought in this guy, Frank Kush, who was hired to save this franchise. Although Kush had been successful as a college and CFL coach, his reputation as a person was questionable at best. In 1979, former Arizona State punter Kevin Rutledge filed a $1.1 million lawsuit against the school, accusing Kush and his staff of mental and physical harassment that forced him to transfer. The most dramatic charge was that Kush had punched Rutledge in the mouth after a bad punt. Kush was later fired after meddling with the investigation, but was eventually found not liable in the case. Then in 1981, as a CFL coach, Kush attempted to ban the common practice of taping shoes and ankles, which caused friction between him and players. Now, despite those issues, this hard-nosed discipline, as some may call it, is what owner Robert Irsay felt the Colts desperately needed after how things fell apart the year before. Now, other than coaching, to call the changes made to the team from 1981 to 1982 a roster overhaul would be a massive understatement.
In 1982, the Colt organization began the most massive rebuilding program in league history. With a fresh front office approach and a new coaching philosophy, stressing fundamentals and conditioning, the Colts suited up 31 new players, an astounding 64% turnover in personnel.
Almost overnight, the Colts became the youngest team in the NFL, with nobody on the roster having more than 4 years of experience. Essentially, they felt that 1981 team was so far gone that it was just best to completely nuke the roster. Perhaps the biggest change was that they got rid of former MVP quarterback Burt Jones and looked to replace him in the draft.
Baltimore Colts select in the Rams spot on the first round, quarterback Art Schlichter of Ohio State.
What's crazy is Art Schlichter lost the quarterback battle in training camp to their 4th round pick that year. And Schlichter's gambling problems, which included blowing his entire $350,000 signing bonus by mid-season, ultimately led to his demise. And this wasn't even the biggest problem for the team that year. The Colts actually showed progress in training camp and through the first 2 games of the season. But then, the players' strike of 1982 happened.
Abrupt halt. For 57 days, the Colts complex lay dormant. During the layoff, the young Colts lost their conditioning edge when they were unable to maintain the constant repetition of fundamentals.
No team got hit harder by the strike than the Colts did. With such a young roster and a mountain of work ahead, the strike crushed anything positive they had going. Just prior to the first game back from the strike, Cush told reporters, quote, "I really wouldn't expect too much." The Colts proceeded to get humiliated 37-0. After the contest, Cush called out everybody. Quote, "We were in no way mentally prepared to play that game. That includes the coaches who did not get prepared properly. They ought to be embarrassed." Cush also called the Colts showing a, quote, "disgrace to football." And then he made his team practice in full pads the following day. Long story short, the 1982 Colts finished 0-8-1. Since then, only 2 other teams have finished a season winless. What I also find wild is the fact that this 82 team still outperformed the 81 Colts statistically, losing by less points on average. Overall, the fact is both teams sucked. And the following year, the misery continued on draft day. With the number 1 pick, the Colts had drafted a potential once-in-a-generation quarterback talent. But earlier in the draft process, Elway told Baltimore that he did not want to play for the team. He publicly threatened to join the Yankees full-time if they did not trade him. Elway's agent even wrote in his journal, which was published 3 decades later, that, quote, he would be a garbage collector before he'd play for Baltimore.
It was nothing against the city of Baltimore or anything like that. It was just a matter of what I had to do what I thought was best for John Elway, and that the situation at Baltimore was not better than the situation I had with baseball.
John Elway went on to have a Hall of Fame career in Denver. For the Colts, 1983 would mark the end of an era. Despite improving to a 7-9 record that year, what was going on behind the scenes was a battle between team ownership and the city of Baltimore. And despite publicly claiming that he wouldn't move the Colts,
I have not any intention of moving the team. If I did, I would tell you about it, okay?
On March 28 and 29, in 1984, after the city of Baltimore was on the verge of passing legislation allowing the city to seize the team via eminent domain, Robert Irsay moved the franchise via moving trucks to Indianapolis in the middle of the night.
Today D-Day, Bob?
D-Day for what?
Decision?
No decisions.
No decision?
Nobody tell them about.
Just information today?
No information.
A shocking move that still has the people of Baltimore embittered to this day.
I remember it was one of the worst nights of our history.
I think it's totally despicable.
I just can't believe this is happening.
I doubt if Robert Irsay realizes tonight the full impact or the extent of his sin in pulling away a football team that was a big part of the fiber of Baltimore.
The final years of Baltimore Colts football were miserable. They had the worst stadium in pro sports, the worst statistical defense in NFL history that still holds records to this day. They failed to win a single game in 1982, and the city had their team ripped away from them in 1984. For 13 years, the city of Baltimore went without NFL football.
We've got 27 years involved at Corrals with this ball club, so why should we stop? We'll be here when the new Colts come in.
Coming up next on Sports Center, artwork.
The Browns are indeed coming to Baltimore.
The Browns make a run for Baltimore, leaving no joy behind in Cleveland.
In 1996, Baltimore got an NFL franchise back with a new mascot, the Ravens. This name was inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. The main theme of this poem is one of undying devotion, which was paying homage to the citizens of Baltimore. Many former Baltimore Colts players, led by Johnny Unitas, disowned the Colts franchise after the move to Indianapolis, instead choosing to remain loyal to the city of Baltimore. These former players embraced the new Baltimore Ravens franchise when it arrived in 1996. Another example of this devotion to the city was the Baltimore Colts marching band, which continued to operate after the Colts moved, playing at football halftime shows and marching in parades in Baltimore. Once the new franchise arrived in town, the band became the Baltimore's Marching Ravens. And to go along with the poetic theme, this is the coolest part about the new Baltimore football team. The 2000 Baltimore Ravens managed to win the Super Bowl. This was the ultimate prize to those fans who longed for the return of a pro football team. And I'm sure some fans got a kick out of the fact that the Indianapolis Colts to that point had not won a Super Bowl yet. But my favorite part in all of this is the fact that the 2000 Baltimore Ravens had arguably the greatest defense in NFL history, giving up the least amount of points in a season in the 16-game era. Talk about the perfect opposite to the 1981 Baltimore Colts.